Well, welcome to our next edition of Austen Wednesdays. I am very, very pleased to be here today with Julienne Gehrer, who has written some astonishing things around Jane Austen and food and her household. And today we're going to talk about a really important figure in Jane Austen's life who's sometimes a little too shadowy, but your work is going to bring her to light in new and exciting ways. And this is Martha Lloyd. So Julienne, tell us a little bit about the background to this project and about Martha.
Thank you, Lizzie. I am pleased, very pleased to work on this project. It's been actually the joy of my life. So thank you very much for allowing me to work on it and for hosting this, being in this interview with you. What was your question? I was so excited.
So tell us a little bit about Martha.
Sure.
It's Martha Lloyd. Yes, who was she and how does she fit into the Jane Austen story?
It's funny. You'll probably see me bristle visibly when people refer to Martha Lloyd as the Austen's cook, because that is the misconception that's come up a couple times. Martha was actually one of the very closest friends of Jane Austen and Jane's sister Cassandra. I like to call her Jane's best friend. She is quoted in Jane Austen's letters as being the friend and sister under every circumstance. Some people refer to her as a second sister to Jane and Cassandra Austen. She's a close confidant. She keeps secrets. She was allowed to read manuscripts before they were published. She was there in times of birth and in times of death in the Austen family, as the Austens were there for Martha's family. So she's a very close friend, and she had the great privilege of living with the Austens in Southampton at Frank Austen's house, and then later on at Chawton Cottage. The whole time that Jane was living there and writing or revising her novels, Martha was there. To me, she's the proverbial fly on the wall. What she knew, what she saw is immense, and I would have been thrilled to have been in Martha's shoes.
I know that Jane writes in some of the letters about never seeing someone as elegant as Martha. So we get sort of shadowy hints of her being an elegant, intelligent character, which, as you say, is completely at odds with the idea of her sort of just being in the kitchen and hidden away. So she becomes very, very central to the family and for a long time. And what is her household book?
Her household book is actually something very typical of the time period. It is her repository for important household information. So you'll see household books from the time period and even earlier, and the content varies considerably. You can have household accounts, you can have culinary recipes, veterinary recipes, household preparations like varnish for tables, cold cream. But Martha's book is very much culinary based, and she stated her interest by opening the cover of that blank book and writing cookery interest on the inside left cover. So it's primarily recipes, about 75% that are culinary recipes and about 25% that are either veterinary, medicinal, or household preparations.
And what's your favorite recipe?
It's hard because there are so many, and it's like picking between your children. I've spent so much time with these recipes. One of my favorites is actually, it's the easiest, and it's toasted cheese. And it sounds silly because Americans don't make toasted cheese like the English do.
We definitely make toasted cheese. We have a lot, so certainly in this household anyway.
We make a grilled cheese, so it's a closed face sandwich. So when Jane Austen mentions that she enjoys toasted cheese, and when Edward Bridges ordered it for supper entirely on her behalf, we know that it was known within the family that she really enjoyed that dish. There's also white soup, and there are two recipes for white soup. One is in Martha's book, and one is in the Knight family cookbook. And so it's just going to have to toss a coin to see which one Jane enjoyed the most. But those are the recipes that are my favorites, are the ones that I can connect with Jane Austen. It was amazing to me to first experience the book and see some of the family names flipping through as I flip through the pages. I should say carefully, I shouldn't say flipped. but you see some of the same names that come up in Jane Austen's letters, and you realize this is a tremendous piece of history. At first blush, there's this connection with the Austen family, but every recipe is a slice of life from the 18th and early 19th century. You can look at the ingredients, you can look at the cooking practices, you can look at the spices. You can also envision life at the cottage through the recipes. So it really is this window into Jane Austen's life as much as it's a window into Martha's life. And it really is a privilege to kind of pull Martha out of the shadows and bring her into a light of her own, because Jane Austen's light is rather dimming, and you don't see anything besides her for a while.
No, you don't. And I think Martha, as you say, she definitely deserves to be center stage for a while. She's really quite an extraordinary hidden character, and I think it's wonderful the work that you're doing to really bring her words. In some extent, we do have this other book that's created in the house alongside and textual, and to bring that into center stage. But how did you come to be working on the book and to work with Martha Lloyd?
Actually, I first saw Martha Lloyd's book clear back in 1996, my first trip to Jane Austen's cottage. And it was my first trip to England, and I was not going to miss Jane Austen's cottage. So the book was in a display case, and I was fascinated that there was a recipe book in the household and that it belonged to someone who lived in the household. And this little seed was planted then, and it germinated for many years. I started doing some culinary research, and I love the period of Jane Austen. And so naturally, those two came together, and I became more and more interested in the household book. And I realized back in the 70s, Peggy Hickman did a book that transcribed some of the recipes. At the time, it was considered the complete book, and we know differently now. Poor Peggy was working with photocopies, black and white photocopies, and you can imagine how difficult it is to read the handwriting in those. I've had the privilege of working with the color scans and blowing up, the recipes and being able to trace the hand with my own to decipher certain words. So I went back to Chawton in 2015. And I had asked if I could have an experience with Martha's book. And I was granted that because I was doing some serious culinary research for a presentation to the Jane Austen Society of North America. Well, I was hooked at that point. Well, I went back in 2015 and 2016 to do Dining with Jane Austen, and I had the chance to research those recipes and connect them to Jane Austen for the book Dining with Jane Austen. So I researched up to 15. In 15, I photographed the food. In 16, and up to 15. In 15, I photographed the food. In 16, and I worked with Mary Guyett after that when she came to the house as the director. And I said, you really need to publish that. So the proposal went in. Before the proposal went in, I asked Deidre LaFay if she would be so good as to do a foreword to the book. She agreed, and I do believe that strengthened the proposal. And the Bodleian accepted it for publication, and then we started working.
It's just this phenomenal scholar, Deirdre LaFay. So just wanted to honour, she has passed away this year, and she did so much for so many Jane Austen projects. You've actually handled this book. But I haven't yet. It's been a funny year, but what does it feel like in every sense, and emotionally, but also actually to touch these pages?
The book is surprisingly small. Now, please understand that I first saw this book in 96 and forgot its physical size. So over the years, it got larger and larger in my mind.
Yeah.
So I returned to Chawton in 2012 and could actually hold the book. And I was like, oh, I don't remember it being so small. Well, it hadn't changed. It's wonderfully compact. It is cover to cover with handwriting, inside to inside. It is well worn, which does not decrease its value. To me, it enhances the value because it shows this book was well used, well consulted, and that despite its frequent use, it still exists. So It has been valued and passed down within the family. It is delicate. The outside pages crumble. And I was very careful, to ask, can I open it? And she said, yes, I could. As I spent time with the book very carefully, moving a few pages to the point where I could see some of the family names in the book. It was an awe-inspiring experience to have something, your hands on something that is so historic and so important to revealing a certain aspect of Jane's life.
That's amazingly emotive experience. You captured it well. You were saying through it that it's the book isn't pristine, is it? It's very definitely being used. This isn't, for want of a better word, an academic thing. Martha isn't gathering these recipes to just hand over. This is really being used. It's been in the kitchen and had what we all do with cookery books, is got things on it.
Exactly. And as a matter of fact, if you'll let me share the screen, I will show you a page of Martha's book that shows it in action. So there are some various pages of Martha's book, and let me go here to this one and make it large for our viewers.
Oh, wonderful.
So there is Martha's book, and this is an example of a page from the inside. And in fact, I should go back a little bit and show you. Let me show you. There's a typical spread. So on the one hand, this is page 20. So this is early on in the book. The book is numbered up to page 100. And then Martha stopped numbering the pages. There are roughly 190 some, I think 96 recipes within the book. As I said, 75% of those are culinary. So the largest section of the book is culinary. And this is page 20. So this is fairly early on when Martha is starting her writing. And so you see the various recipes, and she has written them in sequence, one after the other, which is marvelous. She didn't just start a recipe on a new page. She was very judicious with making the best use of the paper and getting as much into the book as she possibly could. But that also helps us date the book. Because you can't take the book and rearrange the pages. It's not a loose leaf binder, and it's not separate sheets and you can shuffle them. But having a bound book, and in many places the binding is, the stitchery is still intact, to know what was transcribed first, second, third, etc. So you get a general idea of the sequence in which Martha wrote in her book, which lets you walk in history with her, which again to me is very fascinating. So let me unshare, because you might have another question.
I was going to ask you a question actually about the handwriting. So, and does it change throughout the book? Do you get a sense of effectively Martha's handwriting? All of our handwriting changes as we age, and it changes shape. Do you get a sense of a timescale from the recipes of how they're being produced?
Yes, I very much do. It's still very identifiable as Martha's hand, but let me show you some examples that illustrate that early page you just saw, which is page 20.
Yeah, now, I like the pickled onions there. That's a very English and British dish, pickled onions. That's very good. Very good.
That's one of the ones I've modernized. It's delicious. Of course, I love onions. So let me go back to this escape. And so that was page 20. Let's go on a bit here. So here's page 98. So when you saw 20, the handwriting was a bit more upright, large. So you will see it becomes a little more slanted and slightly more compact. To me, it looks a little mature, not that it looked immature in the previous, but you know, it perhaps has a little more speed and purpose here. So maybe she's done a lot of transcribing and she just wants to capture the recipe and isn't so concerned with being as tidy. Occasionally, I do see some blank spaces like this through the book. It's not common. It's pretty much filled. But there are a few pages where that start with the recipe and the rest is blank. So it is surprising, but perhaps she knew a larger recipe was coming and she didn't want to start it in that small space. Okay, let me unshare for your next.
So we get a sense of a very organized person who's really keeping everything together. What sort of role do you think she played within the Austen household? So we have, it's certainly a question that we do get asked a lot with visitors coming to the house, is quite how the relationships all fitted together. And often when we're showing what we call the historic kitchen, people do ask, would Jane Austen have been in the kitchen? And I don't know that she would. Maybe making herself toasted cheese every so often. But what role do you think with this? So we have a household of women that are quite extraordinary, all in their own way, very intelligent. Every single one, certainly Mrs. Austen was quite renowned for being bright as a young woman, and her poetry, she writes extraordinary in her own way. Where does Martha fit into this quartet, and how do you get a sense of her personality at all through the book and through the recipes?
Yes, I do. I think Martha is likewise intelligent, gifted in different ways than Jane Austen. And we don't want to get in the business of sharing their intelligence, but their talents are very different. In Jane's earlier life, she fancied herself as a good housekeeper and recounted her mom's praise of that. But the writing took over as her primary interest, and there's, thank goodness for that. I was gonna say, there's no shame in that. There's a treasure in that. Martha loved the domestic side of housekeeping. Martha's role within the family was very much like a third daughter, actually, to Mrs. Austen. In fact, when Martha's sister Mary is on the verge of marrying James Austen, Jane's eldest brother, Mrs. Austen sends a welcoming letter to Martha saying that you will be my daughter too.
Oh, how wonderful.
Yeah, so I think those women are extremely close in all matters of life and death, and in simple domestic matters. And that's a very good question about whether or not Jane was ever in the kitchen or Martha was ever in the kitchen. And let me just say that there were hired cooks at the cottage. We do know, though, that Jane made the morning breakfast, just toast on the hearth there in the dining parlor. So simple things, you can imagine them making themselves. However, major meals you expect the cook to make, and those things were referenced in the cooks were referenced in Jane's letters. However, anyone who has planted a garden or lived near an orchard, and there was an orchard on the property at Chawton, knows that at harvest time you are inundated with either apples or green beans or peas in the early spring. I have a very hard time seeing the cook with bushels of peas and no one helping her shell,
yes,
or no one helping her peel the apples. I think in a period of great busyness in the kitchen, you might see many people in the household with a paring knife. We have no documentation of this, but it's hard to imagine that those women living together wouldn't have pitched in to help, in times of abundance.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right. And you certainly see it in Jane's novels, don't you? Particularly in that difference between Longbourn and actually in Lucas Lodge. In Lucas Lodge, all the girls help, don't they? And we would be looking at if a household of Lucas Lodge's status, the girls all helped. They certainly would have in our Chiltern cottage, which was not Lucas Lodge by the time the Austens were living in there. So they would have been. Yeah. I love the idea of Jane Austen podding peas while thinking plotlines. I think that's fabulous. I absolutely love it. So Martha they're very connected, the Lloyds. So her sister marries James, is James's second wife, isn't she? And Jane seems to have a slightly odd relationship with Nick. She's not always unsarcastic about her in her letters, is she? But Martha, she really has a different place of affection for. Where did they come from, the Lloyds? Where were they growing up closely to the Austens? They're connected.
Sure, good question. The Lloyds hail from Little Hinton in Wiltshire. So it's a neighboring county of Hampshire. And Martha was born in 1765, so 10 years before Jane Austen in Wiltshire. In fact, all the Lloyd kids were born there. Martha had two sisters and a brother. She is the daughter of Noyes and Martha Lloyd. He was a parson, like Jane Austen's father. Her mother, Martha's mother, had some aristocratic ties, as Jane's mother did.
Yes.
So there are some parallels there before the women ever met. Over time, the Reverend Lloyd got a parish in Berkshire, and everyone moved there, of course. And eventually, poor Reverend Lloyd died, And Mrs. Lloyd got wind of a parsonage for rent, and that was Dean Parsonage, which was Mr. Austen's to rent. And she got wind of this from the cousins, the Fowles. Well, the Fowl boys.
Yes, I know that name.
Bulwer Craven and Tom Fowl were pupils of Reverend Austen and friends of Jane's brother James. So they let their aunt know of there's this place for rent from our former tutor, and they took up rent at Dean Parsonage, which is just within a long walk, but a walk from Steventon. And Jane and Cassandra became fast friends with Martha and Mary. In fact, one of the earliest pieces of Jane's Juvenilia is dedicated to Martha.
Oh, how wonderful.
It's Frederick and Elfrida, and it's,
yes.
In fact, I have, if you'll let me share the screen again.
Oh, please do, yes.
I'll have the dedication because it's from volume the first, and that is in the collection at the Bodleian Library. Aren't we lucky for that they're doing the book? All right, let me get back to my view here. All right, so here is the dedication. So this is shortly after that. And let me make it large, and I will attempt to read the handwriting. To Miss Lloyd, my dear Martha, as a small testimony of the gratitude I feel for your late generosity to me in finishing my muslin cloak, I beg leave to offer you this little production of your sincere friend, the author.
That's gorgeous, isn't it? That's absolutely beautiful. And Jane is 15 when she's, no. Yeah, she's 15 when she's writing that, isn't she? So we've got a very strong sense of a friendship that then lasts and continues throughout her life. Which is
right, until Jane's death. And sadly, Martha was not, let me unshare here so you can see a face. There we go. So we were talking a bit about Martha being at the cottage when Jane died. So you talked about that Jane dedicated this work to Martha, Frederick and Elfrida, when Jane was probably 15. Now, they met when Jane was 13. So we don't know what else Jane wrote, but at least we have this in volume the first. And so those two met, Jane's 13, and those two were close friends until Jane's death in 1817. And sadly, Martha was not at Jane's bedside when Jane passed away, but Mary Lloyd was. Mrs. Austen would not stay alone, overnight alone. And that happened some years before that. And so you can see in the Jane Austen's letters that Jane, Cassandra, and Martha are kind of coordinating vacation schedules. So somebody's always home with Mrs. Austen. And the person home with Mrs. Austen when Jane died was Martha Lloyd.
It's Martha.
So the next day, when they find out, they hear the news of Jane's death, there is Martha with Jane Austen. And we can imagine the two of them consoling each other.
Yes.
So that speaks to the closeness of the relationship.
It's extraordinary close, isn't it? It's just this sense of, I think that's what's wonderful when you start to look in more detail at these huge network of connections, I think, because we can sometimes see, even in the house, you have the writing table and she's there and she's writing. And I think often with Jane, we have a tendency to almost take her out of her context, sometimes, not so much. Whereas actually she's part of that. She's a friend, she's a sister, she's a daughter. She's a hugely important person to lots of people, but it's such a large network as well. And Martha herself had all of these connections within the local area, and they were very important to a lot of people. I just think, and it's extraordinary to see that coming through in these recipes. What sort of names, family names, where are they coming from with different people?
Well, you certainly see Craven, Fowl, Digweed, Dundas. Oh my gosh, there's a whole host of others. I think there are 26 names associated with the family. To me, the most precious recipes are those from Mrs. Austen and from Captain Austen. Now, there were two Captain Austens, so Jane's younger brother Charles and the older brother Francis. But since Mary lived in Francis's home in Castle Square and eventually married him, my money is on those are Frank's recipes.
And she does, I mean, I was working at Jane Austen's house for longer than I care to admit before I realized And Martha marries Frank. How long after Jane's death does Martha stay at Chawton Cottage as part of that household? And when did she marry Frank?
Good question. She stays at the household until she marries Frank. So I did a little timeline. I'm just going to show the viewers because there are so many significant dates in Martha's.
There's a lot.
A lot of these connect to Jane Austen or a family member. So I was joking before we started filming that I can memorize more recipes more than I can a timeline. So I did put down when Martha and Frank were married. So Frank's first wife, Mary Gibson, passes away in 1823 at the birth of their 11th child. And you see this more than once in Austen family history.
Yes.
Because Edward's wife, Elizabeth, dies with the birth of their 11th child. So if you're in Austen, you should stop at 10.
That's the rule.
Story. But about 5 years later, that's when Frank and Martha marry. They marry in 1828. So all that time, Martha is living at the cottage with Cassandra, and she's at the cottage when Mrs. Austen dies.
Yeah.
So Frank and Martha marry in 1828. And I always have to point this out that the wedding date they selected was the wedding date that Frank and his first wife had.
Really?
Now, isn't that surprising? Yeah.
That is surprising.
Yep, it's July 24. So
yeah.
You have to know that those women that Mary and Martha were close, because you would not marry a man and agree to be married on his wedding anniversary to another woman unless you admired and honored her. So I think the household in Southampton was very close. I mean, Frank wanted Jane and Mrs. Austen and Cassandra and Martha to be part of the household to keep his bride happy when he was off on voyages with the Royal Navy. So all of those women got along incredibly well. And to your point about Mary Austen, Martha's sister, Mary Lloyd Austen, I don't know if she would have fit in the mix quite as well as Martha did.
No, I get that sense in Jane's letters. She's, yes. About Mary.
To your point about where
I'm going to describe it as intolerant. She's slightly more intolerant of Mary is probably the best way to describe it.
That's a good point. There's some distance there. So you asked where Frank and Martha lived. Initially, they lived in Gosport, Government House. So that's the house that the Royal Navy provided for Frank to live in. And Frank originally lived there with his wife, his first wife, Mary Gibson, after the house in Castle Square. And for a while at the time on the Isle of Wight. So eventually they lived in Gosport, which is, very close to Portsmouth, convenient for the Royal Navy. And so when Mary dies and 5 years later, he and Martha marry, they move into Gosport. And there's this wonderful letter written from Gosport to James Edward on the occasion of his engagement to Emma Smith. And there's a wonderful descendant of Jane Austen, Freydis Welland, who's a member of our Jane Austen Society of North America, who allowed us to publish that letter with this book.
Wow.
So that is her gift to this project.
Oh, thank you so much for that. Thank you. A wonderful gift. Thank you.
So shortly after that, there's an inheritance, large saga. If you want to go into that, let me know. But let me share the screen where they eventually moved to. Frank and Martha eventually moved into a house, back to this view, called Portsdown Lodge. And it is a large estate not far from Portsmouth called Portsdown Lodge. And so if you can imagine Martha Lloyd, so living a pretty simple existence her entire life, and for a while being very concerned with her finances, as the Austen women were in Bath, in Southampton, and very relieved to move into the cottage in Chawton. So eventually, after Frank inherits from his aunt Lee Parrott, this is the property he purchases.
Wow.
So, and I shouldn't say inherit, she gives him a settlement having to do with some squabble over inheritance, but she gives him a settlement while she's still living, and he purchases this large property. And years later, it's sold under this description as having, let's see, 4 living rooms, 14 bedrooms, plus servants' quarters, farm buildings, and 25 acres of rich pasture land.
That's quite extraordinary. Wow.
Soon after this,
A change from Chawton Cottage.
Frank also becomes, this is a good year, Frank becomes Knight Commander of Bath.
Yeah.
And so then we have Martha becoming Lady Austen.
Wow.
So Martha did extremely well.
Well done, Martha. In some ways, it mirrors the story in some of the stories in Persuasion, doesn't it, to some extent? Oh, before you close that down, you showed me before we started an exquisite picture of Southampton as they might have lived there, which I think is beautiful. Which so this was the house that they were all living in together before they came to Chawton Cottage.
Exactly. So this is the house at Castle Square, and Castle Square is an area here just on the waterfront. So this is the old city wall of Southampton.
Yeah.
And up here, over here, is a little turret of this folly that the Marquis de Lansdale built. So this is just a black and white. I'm sure the original is a color, a watercolor. But then this is a beautiful painting.
It's gorgeous. It's just exquisite. I've not seen this before about that earlier this today, and I think it's absolutely stunning.
In fact, the Bodleian Library sourced this one. They, like I said, they've been wonderful partners in the book and added to Martha's book and the presentation of it tremendously. But this is a beautiful painting by Sebastian Pether, and you can see I've done this, made a tacky little circle on his painting. But that is the house at Castle Square. So this is Southampton by moonlight. And you can imagine in the daylight, Jane and Martha taking walks along this old city wall. Martha's letters reference taking the walks and the sea breezes. The city wall also, there's a wall that goes adjacent to the Castle Square house that actually provides some shelter for the garden. So there's kind of a microclimate at the garden in Castle Square. And so Jane's letters reference picking currants far past the usual season because of the protection provided by the city wall. It's a wonderful house.
I think in some ways it's quite a metaphor for a lot of Jane's life and her writings, actually, that they're quite isolated and they're behind walls and they're quite closed, but yet she's on the verge of this extraordinary outside world in the same way that, you know, Jane is writing from this, you know, her 2 inches of ivory, her miniature, but yet her brothers, and they are all over the world. They are exploring. And I think this is actually a very good, I think it's quite a metaphor for her life experience, and with Martha as well, that they are in this tiny closed household, but yet it's such a global experience that they have in their own way. I think it's extraordinary.
Well, I will piggyback off your metaphor with another one, because there is more to that house that meets the eye. Jane called to it as the commodious old house in Castle Square. That house must have had a very large cellar because the Austens begin brewing there. And they had not brewed when they were in Bath. There wasn't the space, but they did brewing at Steventon. So here is where they can make orange wine. They can make Jane's, well, I don't know if they made mead here. I know they did at the cottage, but Jane said that Martha is coming. And so the spruce beer is being brewed in anticipation. That was Martha's favorite beverage.
Martha's favorite tipple.
And look at how wonderful they are to brew it because she's going to be coming and they want to have the beer ready. This is also where Mrs. Austen oversees the curing of large hams for Frank to take on his sea voyages. So there's some space to this house. And I think it probably made Mrs. Austen, Jane, Cassandra, and Martha feel rooted again after having an agrarian lifestyle where they had land and space. They didn't have the land here, but at least they had a large garden and they could do the things that they couldn't do in Bath. So I think there was a rooting here that took place that Chawton just built on.
Yes. So that sense of coming home and developing a home started here. Extraordinary. It is really beautiful. Could you give us a little sneak peek of what the book's going to look like?
Oh, sure. Let me go back.
It's going to be very beautiful.
Here again, I'm going to praise the Bodleian Library. Here is the proposed cover of the book, and it's I don't imagine
gorgeous.
Isn't it beautiful? This actual, the artwork on the cover is from the mid 1700s. So, you know, it predates Jane Austen and Martha, but that's okay because I'm thrilled with it because it speaks to that legacy between female members of the family, of one teaching another and a woman learning beside, at her mother's side.
Yeah.
So that is perfect for Martha and the household book. It's perfect because of the domestic scene. We really don't know if that's a servant with the lady of the house, but I envision it to be, you know, a woman learning at her mother's side. So it's simply perfect.
Yes.
It's part of the royal collection. So thank you, Your Majesty, Queen Elizabeth II, for this. It's a beautiful shot. And the book will be about, I think it's 312 pages. We're doing the page layouts now, but that's the anticipated size of the book. And the publication is hoped to be in June of 2021. In the year of COVID, we never say anything, but it looks like we're holding fast to that.
So there were other household books at the time. How does Martha's compare to other things that were being produced at a similar time and earlier, actually, going back to the time period portrayed by that image?
Sure. Household books do go way back, and there's one from the early 1700s in the Hampshire Records Office from I call it the Jervois family, but I think anglicized it's the Jervis family of Harriet, which isn't far from Steventon. And as a matter of fact, the descendants from that family ended up being tenants on Edward's Chawton estate.
Wow.
And there's a connection if you pull up his account book, which is also at the Hampshire Records Office, which is my version of a toy shop because there's so much.
It's astonishing. It's an astonishing place. If you're in anybody watching, if you're in Hampshire and you want to, well, even if you just want to research something for the sake of it, it's an extraordinary building, and they just have room after room after room of just treasures and things to discover. It is well worth a visit. It's really extraordinary. It's a lovely place. Amazing.
In Edward's account book, you see rent payments from the Jervis family. So I was thrilled that there was their household book, which is somewhat similar to Martha's in that it has the majority of the entries are culinary, the recipes, but there are also accounts in it, which speaks to the origin of a household book. It was originally a place where you would write the household accounts. And you can see the handwriting in that book, the recipes going over the columns that were originally intended for pounds, and pence.
Right. Yeah.
So that one is earlier than Martha's, but somewhat similar. Then there's another one that's very similar that is from Lady Montague of Beaulieu, which again is in Hampshire, again with the same proportion of culinary to medicinal. And then there's one, I have to say, I thank Deidre for this, and this is it in modern form, but it is Lavender Water and Snail Syrup is the title of this book. Miss Ambler's Household Book of Georgian Cures and Remedies. Now this is Elizabeth Ambler, and she lived in the North. She had an epileptic brother and an unwell father. And her mother died early, so she had the care of both her brother and her father. And the majority of her book is cures, household cures.
Oh, interesting.
So this is what women did. They tailored the contents of their household book to their family need. So I've been able to compare Martha's book to people in a similar situation, as well as those in a very different situation. The Curtis Apothecary in Alton, where Mrs. Curtis kept a household book. And we have that one, and I think you can still buy it at the Curtis Museum. So their Quaker family book, this is another one handed down through generations. Her book is primarily, in fact, it's exclusively recipes. Well, there are no cures. Hello, her husband was the apothecary.
Her husband's the apothecary. It doesn't need cures.
Absolutely not necessary. And then there's another one, and here's the modern version, the housekeeping book of Susanna Watman. So she married an affluent paper mill owner, and her primary job was running the household in such a way that he could entertain his business connections. So he set an expectation, and it was her job to deliver with this elegant meal in a very well-run house. So the majority of her book is how to run the household.
Right.
So you can see how household books vary considerably. There's another one in the Hampshire Records Office that's primarily cures for game. And I wonder if the lord of the manor or his gamekeeper had a hand in that one. Primarily, we see this as a feminine duty, but it could be in that case, this was a gentleman who made all this, because all of it pertains to livestock.
How interesting, the difference between the two.
Mm-hmm.
When you came to look at the book, you've obviously had a love affair with this. Is the only way I was going to say related, but no, it's a love affair, and it shows through, and it's your passion for it is infectious and it's glorious. Was there anything when you really came to look at Martha Lloyd's book in great detail? Was there anything that was a surprise? Anything that you weren't expecting that came out of it?
Sure. With the book itself, I was amazed to see that it had flipped, that she had flipped it. Now, can I share my screen and show you that?
Yeah.
So you have this little book, and you have Martha being very judicious with the paper. So here's how I imagine her process based on holding this book and seeing how it's constructed and how she has put her entries in sequentially. So here's the cover of the book. Let me give you a big screen here. So here's the cover of Martha's book. And here she is on the first pages. Inside left, she puts cookery interest. That's my woman. She likes cookery the most. And then on the right, she starts her recipes. And she numbers her pages from 1 to 100 to start with. So you know she's expecting to have many recipes, at least 100 pages worth. And she's got a nice clean start here. Well, she's also very organized. She took the book. If you close it and then you flip it so that it opens on the right side, so it's going to be upside down, that's where she puts her name, and she also puts the index for the book. So she started her recipes, and she very carefully starts her index. She starts the index at the back of the book because she doesn't know how many recipes she has or where to start the index, because she doesn't want to take a page from a recipe and give it to the index. So she starts at the back. So she's made a very efficient use of the entire book. And it was, a blank book when she either purchased it or it might have been given to her. Now, what's interesting is because she started front to back and back to front, working simultaneously, you get to a page where the content meets, where it is truly right side up and upside down.
Yeah.
And kudos to the Bodleian. We had asked that the book be produced as faithfully to the original as possible. And this is how the facsimile in the book is going to look.
Brilliant. That's going to be astonishing. So you get a sense that I love the fact that she's putting an index in from the very start. So she's seeing this as a reference book. She knows it's going to be something that she's going to want to come back to and search for, which I just think is absolutely gorgeous.
You asked about surprises when I held the book, and so those are my initial surprises. There were also some surprises in research, and to me, one of the largest surprises is when I went through the letters from T. Edward Carpenter on the acquisition of the book and the history of the book, and this was not seen to be a very valuable item to the house. And it's not the fault of the people, it's not the trustees of the Jane Austen Memorial Society at that time. It is the person who owned the book. It was handed down in the family to one of Frank's descendants, Rosa Mary Mowell, and Mowll. And she conveys the contents of the book very generally to T. Edward Carpenter and asks if the house would like to purchase it. And that information goes to Chapman, who edited the large collection of the complete books of Jane Austen. Based on her description, says, well, it's not that valuable. There's no much Austen, no authentic Austen in it. Lady Frances Austen doesn't signify, hardly signifies. And not much commercial value. So here you have these people of influence. And the person who owns the book, the person has not conveyed the true nature of the book and the fact that there are original recipes from Mrs. Austen and Frank Austen in the book. She has no idea how it can be compared and connected to Jane Austen's life and connected to her works and her letters. So unbeknown, to these members of the Jane Austen Memorial Trust, it's not a very valuable book. And Mrs. Maule does a little cat and mouse with them, saying she has other Jane Austen items of value. And she eventually gets £75 for a fair copy of Jane Austen's letter to Frank that talks about our Chawton home.
Oh, it's one of my favorites.
That,
It's one of my favorite letters. Lovely.
Isn't that wonderful? Yes.
Gorgeous.
So it is sold along with a household book to the Jane Austen Memorial Trust, and the household book is sold for £5. That's it.
Goodness. If anyone is watching and has a Jane Austen memorabilia that they'd like to sell for £5, we'd be very happy. If there's anything of the of Martha Lloyd's cookbooks, £5 is great. But I think that's, you're right, and it so shows as well how we've again sort of a reappreciation of history and the importance of social history and context around things, and how that has changed over recent decades, and how that seemed to be more important. And we know that a writer can't really write on an empty stomach, and it's filled in that sense around it, which is just extraordinary. I did want to ask you just one more question, which is an odd one, but you say you've got a list of so many significant dates in Martha's life, which again is very similar to Jane's life. It's a life without necessarily strong incident, but it's not a life unlived. What do you think is the most significant, or some of the most significant dates in Martha's life?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I'm not going to land on one date, because I think you could never underestimate the impact of the death of her father or her mother.
Yeah.
Nor could you underestimate the impact of the death of Jane Austen, her close friend. I'd say on the happy side, the most significant date is either when she moves in with the Austen women to start with, because so many good things happen at that point, or when she marries Frank and her life just completely upends itself. Yeah. She goes from being a spinster to a wife, a stepmother, and very soon a lady, you know, and in a large home. So that's kind of the I won the lottery moment for Martha.
Yes.
But we know she married for love and not for money, because Frank's money was not secure at that point. No. In fact, there's even a point at the home in Castle Square where Frank's pay is held up because of the ship's log being lost in the storm. So his pay is held up, and Martha recently is in receipt of her mother's inheritance. And we don't have any documentation of this, but it would be like Martha's character to help with the finances, since she was going to be sharing that home. So there's your answer about 6 dates instead of 1.
6 dates. No, it was wonderful. I did know it was quite an odd question, but I wanted to see. So often you have a biography and there's sort of, you know, there's this happen and there's a momentous change. But I think in so many of these women's lives, it's a sort of steady continuum and accrual of experience that develops them into these extraordinary people living relatively ordinary lives, but within the context of some of the greatest literature ever written, which I think is what makes it extraordinary. This whole interlink of context and writing and domesticity, it all comes together in something really quite extraordinary.
And if I could pick, you know, from a warrior standpoint, I would pick those entire years where they're living at the cottage and Jane is writing or revising her novels. Because to me, that was the first draw, is this woman is living with Jane Austen at the time. What is going on here? You know, did she bring her a plate of toasted cheese as a snack and it got written into Mansfield Park? You know, it's just amazing to wonder what is Spruce Spear written into Emma because Martha loved it. I really don't know. It could be an homage to her friend Martha, but it's fun to draw these connections, and whether or not you have evidence for them, to just see the elements together and to be able to connect those, whether or not it's true to say could be, is still exciting.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for talking with us today. As I said, your enthusiasm for the project is just glorious, and it's so contagious, and I will be making something from Dining with Jane Austen, and I can't wait to read more from Martha Lloyd's household book and to see just the extraordinary, beautiful thing that you've produced. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the conversation, for letting me be involved on this wonderful project. I'm thrilled.
No, it's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Sorry, give me a second. I'm just going to edit this out. I haven't fed the cat. Sorry. The cat is squeaking. The cat is squealing. Phil, pick Purdy up and come. I will edit this out. Well, maybe I won't. Maybe I'll leave it in. It might be funny. Come and see. This is Julie.
Let's see the.
You can see the cat. This is Purdy. She has been.
Hello.
Hello, this is Julienne. This is
his husband.
Really Mr. Mooney, but he's my Mr. Knightley. But this is the cat. She's been wondering. What you can't see is she's been wandering around underneath the table, going, meow, meow. Squeaking for her dinner, which is not in Martha Lloyd's household book. It's how to feed very grumbly cats. But yes, she's been sorry, that was Phil coming going, have you fed the cat? No, she's been screaming the house down. Anyway, back on track.
Thanks.